My name's Dermot Bolton. I was in that, but I was edited out because I was obviously too boring and rubbish for to say anything interesting. So they give me an opportunity to get up here tonight and help chair this panel discussion. And we are going to set the tone of this discussion, not about whether we should have Theresa May's deal or leave with no deal or have another referendum or any of that kind of stuff. That's not what we are here about tonight. We're going to take the spirit of the film, which is really all about bringing people together. We know that there are people in this room who care about this country, who care about how we can move forward, and that's really what we're going to be talking about. So if you've got a really burning thing, a point you need to make about Brexit, do have a little think about if this is the right forum for that. And there's plenty of other opportunities. I suggest a pub or restaurant, cafe, at home, wherever you feel is most appropriate. So that's really kind of what we're doing. I'm not going to ban anything. We're not going to sort of stop you from talking about it. But really what we need to do is consider how we're going to move forward. I think that's what we're going to do tonight. So let's start off by introducing our panel. Immediately on my left here we have Zulfi Hussain MBE, a proud Bradfordian. Zulfi is an entrepreneur and philanthropist with a background in the corporate world, an international speaker, practitioner of inspirational leadership, executive coaching and mentoring and social enterprise. Zulfi has won numerous awards for his personal and professional achievements and his contribution to connecting and building communities at home and abroad. In 2008, he was awarded an MBE for services to business and services to charity, and in 2011, an honorary doctorate in education for the University of Bradford. In the middle, we have Penny Wangari-Jones. Wangari? Oh, I got it completely wrong. Sorry, I really should have asked you that. Penny Wangari-Jones, a West Yorkshire-based anti-racist activist, community organiser and campaigner, known for her public engagements on a wide range of topics, including colonialism, migration, race, racism, racialisation, and intersections like gender, class, mental health, and activism. Penny currently heads the West Yorkshire Racial Justice Network, a network of individuals, communities, and organisations working together to end racial injustice and address legacies of colonialism. Then on the far left here, physically rather than metaphorically, I think, we have Professor Stephen Coleman, who's a professor of political communication at the University of Leeds. He's written several books, including How Voters Feel, which explores how it feels to be a democratic citizen. He's recently conducted a large number of interviews with people about their memories of discussing, avoiding, and falling out over Brexit. Not that any of us here will know anything about that. He has been following recent political developments with morbid fascination, haven't we all? And is of the view that citizens deserve a better democracy than we have. Oh, so I think you can probably find a lot of friends here on that today. But in the spirit of I'm going to ask our guest to give us a few thoughts on the film and what's been going on. So in terms of how you felt about the film and the process and how that was made, as well as how we move forward, if you've got a few minutes to give us your views. Who wants to start?
Well, I think the film reflected very much what the wider nation is feeling, the division between the people. Yeah, the division between the people, and very much in terms of how much it was obvious that people are very strongly opinionated, whether they were based on fact or fiction or fake news, whatever you want to call it. So I think the film brought together a good cross section of people across the region, and I think that is very much about what it's like out there, and it also then shows that many of the people have very entrenched positions and opinions, and how we're going to overcome and try to bring the nation together after all this. There's going to be very interesting times ahead.
The film was well put together in terms of the numbers like you just said, demographics and ages and all of that. I think they captured a lot of different opinions, which was good. And I think what I heard, what came through to me, I don't know about everybody else, was a sense of people being very disconnected, kind of definitely around political illiteracy, but definitely a sense of fear and uncertainty and also insecurity, which I think has definitely more deep-rooted than what we've just seen. And it was interesting that, again, towards the end, was people didn't want to say that the voting was to do with migration, it was around rights, but then a lot of the examples that were given were to do with who's here, who's not here, and and what jobs and all of that stuff. So there was a lot of stuff that was touched on the surface that didn't go underneath, but the stuff underneath actually kind of highlight what's going on the surface as well.
I thought it was a terrific film. I think it was well made. I think it should win an award because it does what we need, which is to understand where we are with politics. And I want to just say a word about why we're there, what we were hearing, what we might want to, how we might want to interpret this. It seems to me from that film and from everything else that's going on around us that we have a lot of politicians who need to learn how to listen, and we have a lot of citizens who need to learn how to speak to each other. And these are two deficits, and they play into each other, and they're very dangerous, because when people don't talk to each other, you have what I would call an empathy wall. You have a point where everybody wants to be understood and everybody wants understanding, but nobody wants to understand the person they don't like and the view they don't like. And the really challenging thing, and this is where politics begins, not where it ends, is in recognizing that there is a disagreement that we are not going to solve by rolling around in the mud and fighting each other. We're not going to solve it by paying each other to have one view or the other. We're going to do it through rational human persuasion. And that's hard work. And politics is very challenging work. And deliberative politics is the kind of politics we were seeing there. And it's what deliberation is about. And it's the missing half of our contemporary democracy, in my view. Because we've got a really good voting democracy. We've got a pretty fair electoral system in this country. There are problems with the way that votes are cast. But when they're cast, they get counted, and you tend to get what you voted for. What we do not have is a deliberative democratic system. We've got a lousy press. We've got a standard of public debate that is uncivil, in which people are rewarded for being crude and unpleasant. And we have some leading politicians who've made their name out of doing that. And a democracy in which listening is not rewarded. So I think that the lesson of that film is that whatever is going to happen after this, and I'll be happy to talk about where we are now, because we're at a really critical moment, and this is the biggest constitutional and political crisis this country has had since 1939. Wherever we're going to go from here, it's not simply about Brexit. It is about how we do politics and how we do democracy and how we get that deliberative deficit filled in, so that we don't only vote on things like sheep walking through a pen, but we also are able to debate about things.
I think definitely the point about people being unheard and invisibilized is kind of something that's kind of came through quite strongly. And the economic drive of, I think, majority of the very personal stories and examples that people are sharing there were, or jobs, definitely working hours. So for me, I think I felt, which is kind of where I was, the comment I made about people's fear and people's kind of insecurity also, there's underneath, and it's also a sense of entitlement, which kind of comes with the colonial hangover of Britain being great and all of that stuff. And things have changed and kind of in terms of globalization, but that sense of push around economic power came through quite strongly, and I didn't hear capitalism mentioned, but I think capitalism definitely has been the biggest driver in terms of what's happening in terms of the inequality. So when people are unheard and they're not being listened to and they're not being given opportunities to live and exist in a way that they wished for, that comes through. And I think there were certain comments around control, and when somebody's saying we want control back, and I was thinking to myself, when have we ever had control in terms of the ordinary person down here? So you're thinking you want control back, which is kind of the point was made about conservatives. If you get control, what does control mean? Who is controlling? And if the things that people are fighting for are anything like what we've seen already, it's going to get worse. It's got worse already because there's been a big push towards kind of more social justice, away from social justice to financial justice, which means the incentives are going in towards people or businesses and the whole humanist element of living and existing. And I almost laughed out when she says, there was a comment around people used to go into each other's doors, and I'm thinking, are we going to blame that on EU? Because, you know, we saw what Thatcher did to the miners and the trade unions and all of that, kind of the whole sense of community being wiped out. So to hear that people can no longer get into each other's houses, and the reason for that is that was like, okay, I'm not sure whether how that sits with me. But there was a lot of other comments around sense of community has definitely been wiped away. Sense of financial existence and people wanting to travel and do all of that.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting themes there around change and how we might be coping with change. We'll have a little think about that. But I wanted to ask Zulfi a little bit about the role of the media and social media in how in this process and how it may have caused more division, or maybe it's got a role in bringing this all together. Zulfi, what's your thoughts on media, all different types?
Well, I think media, and particularly social media, has a lot. It can do a lot of good, but it can also do a lot of harm, because we live in a very fast-paced life and very much in isolation in terms of almost instant gratification, sound bites, and that's what grabs the headlines, and that's what sells the programs and the newspapers, without the actual content and the value of that content. People don't really go beyond whatever the soundbite is or the headline, and I think that's a really dangerous position to be in. And there's so many examples where I think fact has been mixed with fiction and fake news, and people's opinions. And I agree with you from earlier. You know, who controls who, and I think the media has a huge influence on everybody's life. You know, the way the research is done, the psychology behind. You know, if you think of just the way marketing is done, there is a huge amount of money spent on how human interaction happens, and how that can be used to actually manipulate messages across. And so I think, you know, people have to be very careful the way these things are used across, and that whole propaganda from different angles, you know, not from one side or the other, I think is always there, and people just don't seem to actually appreciate that at all, especially the young people. They're very much influenced and live in this bubble, almost like second life, and this, which is really not.
Is it just young people, Zulfi, or do we all exist in bubbles sometimes?
Well, I think we all exist in bubbles, but I think, you know, it's people. There was a great example the other day. You know, somebody was looking at a map, and it just sort of said, "You are here," and the young lady sort of said, "Mommy, how do they know?" You know, and there was just all this thing about they thought they were being tracked. So I think we're all guilty of it, and I think we just got to be a lot more mindful and actually just look behind the headlines.
I'd like to just think about a little bit more about change, and some of the reasons why people might have voted like they did, or why people might be feeling unhappy with things. You know, there's a suspicion, I think, that there's more to a lot of the comments we heard there on the film than just Europe, just being just our membership of the European Union. That is not the whole of it, is it? And what is that exactly? You know, is it actually about change? How we've adapted to change over time? And I have a feeling that, you know, this isn't the end of change. That we, you know, societies, nations, the world always changes. We can't leave the globe in terms of globalization. So, any thoughts on change and how we might? I don't know, Stephen, perhaps, or would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase at the time of the referendum was "take back control," and actually, I think you should take that phrase very seriously. Not as it was used at the time necessarily, but in terms of why it was so attractive to people. People feel out of control. You wouldn't jump at the slogan "Take back control" if you felt in control. People feel disappointed. They feel resentful. They feel that skills that they once had are ignored. That codes of respect that once existed don't exist anymore. They feel that they don't know who's in charge. They feel that they elect a government, but that there are international banks, corporate organizations, goodness knows what, making decisions. And that's not conspiracy theory. They're right to think that, because that is exactly how power does work in the globalized world. And some people decided to focus a lot of that, to project a lot of that onto the European Union. And some people have projected that onto other things. But wherever you decide to go, and that's a political decision, you are right to feel that we are living through a period of massive change in culture, in people's work lives, in people's capacity to control their own existences. And it is not being co-determined. Nobody asks people. So people go into workplaces where they have this torture, of management through PowerPoint, where they're stuck in rooms, told what the new rules are one week, what the rules are next week, the computer system change. They feel out of control, they feel nervous, they feel jittery. And that's what Brexit is about. I mean, I do not believe that 30 million people cast a vote about a trading bloc. They didn't vote about trade deals, they didn't vote about customs unions. These things were hardly ever mentioned during the referendum. They voted because they felt that somehow, by voting one way or the other, they were going to better themselves in relation to a position of relative powerlessness. And I think that's the starting point. I think the starting point is not to blame people for voting one way or the other, or to say that they were stupid, or to say that they were smug. The position is, we are all in this boat together, feeling rather disorientated by a world that seems out of control. Now, my argument would be that if you want to deal with control, you certainly don't simply go to Brussels any more than you simply go to London. It's rather like focus groups that I've run in Leeds and Bradford, where people say the problem is people in London have too much power and we don't have power up here. People in London say the problem is it's people in Brussels. People in Brussels say the problem is it's people in New York. Everybody is assuming that this great power-sucking, dominating beast is somewhere else. The reality is, it's not a person, it's not a government, it's a particular system that we have bought into. And if we buy into it, then complaining about its symptoms is really going to be a bit futile.
From what you were saying there, Stephen, some of the stuff that there was in the film about Hull, I thought that was particularly telling, about Hessel Road and leaving the door open and the fishing fleet. All of these things, they're certainly, I'm not saying that Europe has nothing to do with some of those, but certainly there would appear to be other factors in play. Penny, I mean, we've seen now some thoughts there about how people may feeling from and there certainly reports, weren't there, after the vote around incidents of racial attacks, racially motivated attacks, and comments, even sort of low-grade stuff, all the way through to other things. How have things changed for BME people and non-UK nationals since the referendum, do you think?
I think the point that was made earlier, or just now, around people, the system that it is, I think what has been missing, or we kind of was clear, was people connecting the dots in terms of what the problem is. So yeah, neoliberal structures like the media, the education system, and kind of the government and the policies that are coming through, not necessarily giving people opportunities to really kind of target and go at them. So what we've seen through and through is people going back, as you do, more vulnerable groups or marginalized groups, or people who are kind of in a worse situation than yourself, so you take it out on them, or kind of the scapegoating, which is kind of how it typically works, rather than actually the systems that are above that are creating these kind of whole systems of inequality. So yeah, in terms of hostilities to people, because I think what it also came through through the film was the impact is not just being felt by EU citizenship. And I think when I talked about the colonial hangover, is kind of, there's a bigger problem here around people not wanting people to come here. And I think when we talk about people are here because we were there, or you went and now they're here, and kind of there's wider implications in terms of migrations right now. So when they were pointing out, they're not necessarily saying we are interested or annoyed at just the EU migrants. We know we're talking about migration generally. So when it's come to people who are facing the incidents, it's kind of anybody, that you're othered, whether you're black, brown, have an accent or anything like that. People have felt the impact, and I know we did a lot of work around that, including videos. And I know V actually gave an example of what happened on the train and the consequences of that. So there is also the flip side of the fear and anxiety within communities who don't feel British. I had people tell me they won't pick the phone calls on the trains because they didn't want to be identified. Some of us are unfortunate that you go out, you just recognize because you're black. There's people who are EU citizens that are white, that just meant speaking was the only way of being identified as other, but that is still swimming in and around us right now. So it's kind of recognizing that aspect. So you're going to ask something?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, and is that the case of that non-British nationals are the visible face, literally, of some of those changes, or the visible face or voices of those changes in society, which people are feeling they haven't got a lot of control of.
Yeah, definitely.
Possibly.
And I think that's why they're taking out, because what happened with Nigel and Farage and others, they just not just legitimize it, people saying get out and go and all of that. So, and it's unfortunate that you have instigators who kind of get the crowd going, and then they sit back, and then the people who actually do the acts and actions are the ones who end up getting, court sentence in court. So, you have a policy like the hostile environment, for example, that is created to make life unfortunate and really bad for migrants. But then if the same person goes and says to somebody else to go back where you come from, I can report you that, I can report to the police. So there is kind of the guys who are at the top who are doing and creating smoke screens to allow for certain things to go by whilst they're lying in their pockets. People are not being taxed whilst taking blame and pointing fingers at the people who are not necessarily making much from the system.
Would it be fair to say also that that's happened across the board? We've had a lot of people taking very patronising tones, very condescending about people who voted, Remainers who voted leave, about people who voted leave, talking to them as stupid. Part of the arguments have been happening in families as well. So, there are different things that go on. And is that indicative, do you think, of class divisions as well to some extent? I wonder. But I'd like Zulfi to get in as well, if that's all right.
Well, I think it's true, because it almost legitimizes that language. And if you see your politicians and other leaders using particular phrases or giving information, such as big posters saying 80 million Turks are going to come and invade Britain, then people sort of the seeds are already sown, and the fear factor kicks in, and they feel that if that's okay for these people to use it in the media, see it in the newspapers, then they'll use it out in the street. And certainly straight away from the after the vote, there were people going up to particularly the Eastern Europeans and saying, "Oh, we voted you out now, so when are you going to go home? You should go now," type of thing.
I know Pakistani people in Bradford that had that as well.
Well, they did, and I think you've seen more recent events around anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and these things are actually on the rise.
Even
the Windrush, absolutely, and it's just I never sort of thought I would see us almost returning to the 70s and 80s when I was growing up here in Bradford, where we had so much tension and so much racism and so many problems. It was almost sort of going back to those dark days, and in between, we had huge amount of work that went on in the communities to build those communities, bring everybody together, and now we've been torn apart again.
The class issue is definitely there, but I think it's also worth remembering not everybody who voted to leave was from working class, because I think there's been a kind of another blame game of middle classes also did vote, and even though they have benefited a lot from systems like we said about I don't know, benefits from schooling, from the money that's poured into certain areas. So definitely just worth pointing that out, that not just those that voted working class, but the point, and I think there was clear when he got very sensitive, somebody got very sensitive when he was saying, are you saying people are not educated? And he's kind of saying, no, it wasn't about education, because you can't say you voted on facts when the facts that were out there were so false and also so duped. And Cambridge Analytica was mentioned as well.
I think he was sensitive because people have been saying that, and there has been a lot of talk like that. It's been very disrespectful conversation across the piece. Let's go to some questions now. So if anyone's got any thoughts of things they'd like to say, have a start getting your hand up.
You stated that if we look from the top, everything is fractured. We can't have whatever decision we have is fractured, and in the meantime, in the bottom, we've got people who are desperate to be heard. So I think why not try to reverse and making the other way around, instead of having decision coming from the top. Let's have decisions coming from the bottom. And how can we maybe have communities to make the top more accountable?
Do you think that people voted because they thought the grass was greener on the other side of the hedge?
I think the key thing is about dialogue and communication, and certainly from and unfortunately, a lot of people always think grass is always greener until you realize it's not.
I'd say yes to the bottom up, because I work in organising and activism, and I think there is a lot of people like who need to be heard and haven't had the opportunity, and I think this is a start. The film is a start. The fact that we sat in this room is a start. That people kind of differ in views and opinions sometimes. Just hearing and listening from another point of view is actually one way of changing systems, because the guys at the top are definitely, self-interest is big on there, and sometimes, or most times, the agendas that are being driven are not necessarily catering for the people at the bottom. The second question of the grass is greener, I'd say yes, because I think and it was really good summary towards the end of actually the reason why people are voting or wanted to have these conversations was because we're going for better, we're trying for better. Unfortunately, and I think this is a big unfortunate, whatever's going to come up, I don't think it's good, it's greener, which means it's almost we need to be ready for what then, because it's been easy, or it's easy-ish to blame the person who's more vulnerable than yourself for the faults, like we have seen, for things that are not right. But now that people, if we do leave, and these jobs are not back, we have more migrant communities coming in because of the Commonwealth, and examples that was given there about having to do trade unions or kind of trade with other countries, which also means giving something else away. The fact that I think the reality, which is what I talked about, education system, people haven't necessarily connected the wider picture in terms of migration, in terms of climate change, in terms of colonial past and colonial history, that mean these numbers are not going to get down. Globalization, the reality of that, because when people say we want to go back to days that we used to have, it's like, do you want to go back to horse and carts? Do you want to go, because we have got internet now, which means the world is open, it's kind of the global village is the way it is. So in terms of the reality of coming to terms with that needs to happen, but what follows on after all of this exiting, and then the jobs are not there, the inequality kind of gets worse, all of that, then what do we have then? So I think it's a really key question, and I think that's what Stephen was talking about. We need to be really prepared for what else is coming after that.
So more change ahead.
People didn't just think the grass was greener because they woke up one morning and said, hey, let's not like the European Union. We study this in my university. We study it really seriously. If you look at what has happened every single day from 1975 through to 2016 in terms of the drip, drip, drip of telling people that their greatest enemy and the greatest destruction facing them is coming from Europe, then some people start to think that. They start to make the connection between their problems and that. Let me give you an example. Everybody knows that the European Commission is a massive government, overmanned organisation, bureaucracy. But maybe not everybody knows that the entire staff of the European Commission is smaller than the staff of Surrey County Council. Maybe they don't know that if they read the Daily Mail, because the Daily Mail doesn't often talk about that absolutely incontrovertible figure. Everybody knows that the European Union is constantly interrupting and interfering in our lives. And if you ask people what are the most important laws that have been passed over the last 30 years, they will say environment policy, and 98% of all of those laws were passed in Europe. And we know that the people who are campaigning against Europe in the press are exactly the same people who don't want those environmental laws and who don't want all kinds of other changes that are coming about. So this is real politics. This is real politics. This is not people waking up one morning and sort of rather stupidly saying, hey, Brussels is the cause of all my problems. That would be psychotic. They have actually picked this up over a process of time. On your question, which is a brilliant, the important question for me about top-down and bottom-up democracy, there is no such thing as top-down democracy. I mean, top-down democracy is a corruption of democracy. It's what you were talking about. It is a misuse of words. Of course, you weren't talking about top-down democracy. But the whole idea that democracy can mean unaccountable people making decisions and communities just sitting there and waiting to see what's going to land on top of them is a nonsense. It's a misnomer. It's not democracy. So the question is not how do we deal with the choice between top-down democracy and bottom-up democracy. The question is how do we get democracy? How do we create a real democracy where communities make decisions? Those decisions are informed by public deliberation, by balanced information, and are not interfered with by corporations whose job is to produce propaganda rather than information. That is the only way in which we can sustain democracy. If we can't do that, then we will have more Trumps, we will have more of the perversions of serious policy that we are seeing across the world, and it is extremely dangerous for people. People are suffering because of it. This is not an academic debate. This is a debate about people's lives, and people are suffering because of absolutely lousy decisions made as a result of the absence of good democratic process.
Does it make sense to look at political institutions when we're looking at bringing communities together? Or do we look at social institutions? Do we look at and I'll pinch a phrase from Ivan Illich, tools of conviviality? Do we look at what in society can provide opportunities for people to meet, to talk, not necessarily about politics, but about their lives and what's happening for them? And I'm not thinking in terms of formal institutions, but some institutions which unfortunately are disappearing, like community centres, more informal institutions like cafes, extending the concept of the loneliness cafe to maybe all cafes, so that people can just come in and talk to people who they don't know.
Yeah, just really, it's what are your best thoughts about what's going to be the best way forward now? I mean, it's as simple as that already. Have you got some thoughts about whatever happens as a result of the next few days and weeks? Yeah. How do you see, what good ways forward do you see?
In regard to what's just been said, my thoughts for the future is to become more local, like the Preston model, and Bradford is actually part of a new thing with Bristol with locality.org, where lots money's going to be kept in, the projects are going to be kept in within Bradford and not given out to the big multinational circles of the world.
I can understand what she's tried to do, even though, in my opinion, it were wrong. But I respect her for trying to bring both sides together. It were a way, as well as bringing her own party together, to try and bring the House together and to try and bring everybody else together. It was, to me, it's a middle of the road deal, which she got dramatically wrong.
Theresa May's compromise. So those are the ones.
Well, I guess I'm the only person on this panel who's paid to try to think about what's going to happen in relation to all of this, so let me tell you what I think. And incidentally, I think the point about political and social is absolutely right, although I think they merge into each other. But you're right, I mean, most of what we call politics and political institutions have got absolutely nothing to do in most people's lives, and they never get into them. And politics has got to start where people are, and that's where that film really taught us something. If we needed to learn that people are capable of having very good discussions if they're given a safe space to have them. So that was that. Look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think that some things are definitely going to happen. One is, and I have very great sympathy with your point about the May deal, actually. I think it was probably one of the best possible deals that this country is going to get if it decides to leave the European Union. I mean, I don't know what people think would have been a better deal. It is going to be a deal that will leave decades of disappointment on both sides. Remain people are going to be upset because we leave, and pro-Brexiteers are going to be upset because they haven't got what they thought they voted for. But the only way that you could actually get the kind of compromise of a withdrawal from an organization that you've been in for that many years through international treaties is along the lines that May and the civil servants have come up with. So I think that's going to happen. But I think also people have to realize, and I don't think the British population do realize at the moment, this withdrawal deal is just the prologue. I mean, the really important thing are the trade deals that are going to follow from this. And it's the trade deals where there are going to be decades, and I mean decades, of a continuation of complex economic negotiations in which, in my view, this country will be seriously politically weakened in terms of its economic and trading negotiations, but obviously other people might imagine that it's going to be strengthened. I think it's going to be seriously weakened. Secondly, the EU elections are coming up, and in the EU elections, the whole of the European Union is going to suffer a massive shock. But according to the latest polls, the far-right parties in Europe have about 25% across the whole of the European Union. They will go into the European Parliament and they will try to destroy the European Union, which, as the woman in the film said, is the biggest, richest and most educated trading bloc in the world at the moment. And if it is destroyed, it will be enormously damaging, and it will only empower two places: the United States, currently run by a lunatic, and China, currently a dictatorship. So be very careful. What else is likely to happen? If there is an absence of a deal within the next couple of years, the likelihood of Scotland becoming a separate country is very high, and the likelihood of a united Ireland is very high, because if I were Scottish, or if I were a Northern Irish person, I would want to vote for those things on a basis of rationality, quite aside from any tribalism. And finally, I think that something that is going to happen here is in relation to the economic future, and that is that globalization will go on, and what we do not have is any discussion in this country at the moment about how to regulate globalization or global economic markets. In fact, Brexit is a total distraction from that. And the really important question to ask is, who sets the value of money in the world? Who sets the value of labor in the world? Who decides that certain countries are going to be so unbearable to live in that people have to migrate out of them in order to find tolerable lives in other countries? And all of those political decisions have nothing whatsoever to do with Brexit. And we have no debate in this country about these. The final thing that I think will happen, and of all the things I've said so far, I'm pretty certain about. The final thing I think is likely, but I'm not certain about, is that the party system as we know it in this country is finished. That what will happen is that May I believe will not last more than one more month as Prime Minister. If she is succeeded, as she is likely to, by Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party, it will split, because sane members of the Conservative Party will leave it and refuse to have anything to do with it. So you'll have a split right-wing party, and the Labour Party at the moment, I'm afraid, is in an intolerable mess. And the consequence of all of this is that we are going to have coalition politics, unstable government, uncertain political future, alongside all of this global turbulence. But having said that, there is stability and hope, and it is based on what we saw in that film, which is the deliberative capacity of ordinary people to make decisions and to know what is in their own interest.
I think you have covered majority of what I was kind of thinking what's coming up. It's all kind of doom and gloom, which is kind of unfortunate, but what you just said is probably even further, because like you said, around it's kind of one of the biggest, and it's coming up, and people are not even having those discussions, because people are not just migrating because they fancy it. With climate change, things are going to get worse. And then on top of that, there's all the other economic chaos that's happening around the world. We know, we've seen what's happened in Brazil, again, Cambridge Analytica, the far right, and the whole language around nationalism kind of becoming even worse. So the point that you made around the conversations going back to social, away from politics, unfortunately, it's all connected and intertwined. But it's difficult to separate the two and say we're not going to have the conversations. But it might be that actually the power for shifting and changing things comes from there. As you said, this is one clear example, because what we have seen in terms of finances, there's less and less funding. So the community centres are shutting down. The spaces that people could go and talk and meet and engage, including youth centres, including all of the spaces that you cannot consider, those are all shutting down. And I think it's intentional and deliberate, because the less of us are able to meet and connect on those, the less we're able to actually, the divide and rule kind of has been working and kind of continues. It might be that after all this mess has happened, because what do you do after all of these promises that we've been told don't come through? It will be that actually we go back to those spaces and build our power from those spaces and perhaps change. I think it's Audre Lorde talks about never mass. And I think the fact that we have tried to utilize a system that's not created to hear and recognize everybody, or in the room or in a space, means there is need for something else. And I'm kind of, that's the only glimmer of hope, that I think actually this could be the one time that we change things, and as they exist right now.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. Zulfi, social engagement, localism, Preston model was mentioned. What can we do to rebuild economy, rebuild communities? What have you seen that can work?
Well, I think one of the things, fundamentally, I think we've lost the art of communication. You know, I see people who come to my restaurant day in, day out, and they're even on a date night, and they're actually texting or doing something else rather than talk to each other. You know, and that's a very fundamental starting point. Jill here, I will bear witness, we were involved with a great initiative. We did a walk from Leeds to London, and we just simply called it Walk Talk, and it was about people coming together, walking and talking, who would never otherwise meet, who would never otherwise come together. And we probably had over 3,000 people at different stages, and the amount of change that happened. The incredible thing was there were people living on the same street for 20 years who'd never met until they came on the walk. So I think, you know, even a simple act like that can have a huge bearing. And as you know, in the great words of Rumi, you know, the beyond the realms of right and wrong, there's a field there. I'll meet you there. You know, and I think we've got to get beyond this this craziness that we've actually created. And I think this whole Brexit debate is actually it's been a big distraction from all the other big things that are happening, whether it's the environment, whether it's the rise of the far right, and all the really important things that we're missing, and having, you know, more extensions. And I think all we're going to do is carry on that debate, and you know, that the whole thing about banging your head against the wall and doing the same thing again and again isn't going to get any better. But I think is people in this room and out there from the grassroots who can make the difference.
So we're all responsible for making a difference. Was you all fair to say that
absolutely. We've got to take.
It's up to us.
It's up to us, and because the only thing in life that's constant is change. Change is going to happen irrespective. Globalization is happening. It's there. It can't be stopped. I think what we've got to do as individuals is each one of us needs to, take our responsibility and have that dialogue, because this only way we're going to create and heal these issues and get together is and discussion and debate and understanding each other, and that we've got a lot more in common actually difference.
I think you're absolutely right, and of course everybody in this room is a change maker of some form. You're all here because you're interested. You're all here because you care, and we all have an opportunity to make that difference and to engage with people who are similar to us and people who are different to us. I think that's fair. We're all really grateful for the funding support that Paris to Men gave us for this and made it all possible. But thank you very much. Last word for you, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Dermot, and thank you everybody who's been involved in this project. As Dermot says, the Paris Diamond CIO, we're just quite a small grant-making charity supporting projects in Yorkshire and also in Scotland. Once a year we support a kind of bigger project of this kind, and it was in late 2017 that we thought, given the result of the referendum in Yorkshire, it would be good to have a project to bring people together to hear the different sides of the debate on Brexit. I think Artworks Creative Communities have responded fantastically to the brief they put to us, and we've had a really exciting and challenging film. Thank you so much to all the volunteers who were part of the filmmaking teams, all the people who took part in the panels, people who've been involved tonight, and particularly those involved in the preparation and editing of what has been a very dramatic thing for us tonight. A number of people, though, have said tonight about sort of Brexit has done this or Brexit has done that. We need to remember, of course, that Brexit has not yet happened. When we set the dates for this project, it was all to lead to a launch event round about now, just before the date when the UK was due to leave the European Union. So Brexit may still perhaps happen next Friday night, or it may happen on the 22nd of May, or it may happen sometime in the future. But I would say to everybody, take away what we've learned tonight about how people can talk to each other, how people can listen to one another, and as Brexit really does start to hit us, then that's the time when these things come to play. My role here, I think, is kind of to give the kind of final blessing. I'm conscious we're in a building that's sometimes used as a church, and I'm sometimes involved in doing that kind of thing as a lay minister in church. We sometimes say at the end of church services, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. I would say if you are a person of faith, this really is a time to think and pray about peace, think and pray about our politicians. But I would say to everybody here, go in peace and listen to those with different views on Brexit from yourself, because that's how we move forward as a community. Thank you very much.